super high achiever.
Okay. Hang tight. No, it's all good. Hi, everybody. We will get started in the interest of respecting everyone's time. So welcome. I hope you all know you're here for Louis Chua's proposal defense. This is a work that is in a really interesting transdisciplinary space. So he's going to talk to you about taking some aspects of kind of classical economics and natural capital accounting and trying to put another foot in applying these frameworks to support community Native Hawaiian-led biocultural restoration. So it's really exciting. The title is Insights from Nature Accounting in Hawaii. And yeah, you have, so the way this runs is Louis going to have 35-40 minutes or so to present to us. Then there's going to be time for public questions. We're going to take a short break where you guys can give Louis a hug, congratulate him. You already gave him the lei, but you could give him lei. And then we'll go into closed door with just the committee. So yeah, thank you. And
just for protocol, I think as is NREM tradition, if I could ask everybody to just do a quick fully, and if we can all face Malka, the mountains, and outside of that with the Sita or thank you. Coming everyone. So as you know, this is my oral proposal presentation. I want to thank my committee members, my chair, Dr. Kirsten Olsen, for taking me along to this ride. And I've been brewing and thinking about these things for years now. So I'm very honored to be privileged to be able to present all these things to you. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump straight in. So the motivation for my general research is the couple of things. Market prices generally do not reflect ecosystem contributions. Ecosystems are often common pool resources, the way we look at them, and they're difficult to measure and value, at least cost effectively. And also that cultural lens and worldview can really shape the values of those ecosystem services. So how this is going to be structured is the first section is going to be like a select literature review, where I'll go through some of select literature that will be relevant to my research. And then the next three parts will be broken up into sections of my different chapters. And I'll welcome any questions at the end of each of these sections. I hope that you'll be able to hold off on those questions until those markers and this different sections of those presentation is done. So I've narrowed down to three different fields of research that I think is relevant to my dissertation. First of all is natural capital accounting, NCA. It generally looks at ecosystems as productive assets and value that benefits to humans and society, provides measures of those environmental externalities, as well as provide non-market values of those ecosystem services. They have demonstrable policy impact, especially in the EU, We see them used for carbon pricing, for land use policies, and for the carbon farming incentives. So these are very practically useful things at the state level. And however, these ecosystem accounts contain still large data gaps. There's limited methodological transparency, and only one really addresses the ridge to reef management as we encounter in Hawaii. And there's limited policy uptake outside of the EU at the moment. Another strain is, the natural sciences. We know that Hawaii's ecosystems face existential ecological risks. We know that there's high levels of demicism in Hawaii, and we're often called the extinction capital of the world for that reason. We are especially susceptible to climate change from sea level rise, marine heat waves, ocean acidification, freshwater availability, whether that's from our groundwater aquifers or surface flows, and precipitation, falls in rainfall due to climate change, for example. We also uniquely have very strong ridge to reef connection. So unlike a lot of places in the world, we cannot look at land, terrestrial, freshwater ecosystems as separate from these marine ecosystems. So they're very connected. And I think the last field, which has been a burgeoning field in the last about 20 years or more, is this biocultural approach that offers solutions to these climate challenges. So biocultural approaches are defined as conservation actions that are made in service of sustaining biophysical, sociocultural components of this very interdependent socio-ecological system. Indigenous knowledge systems are key, we know, to climate and resilience solutions, especially in the recent Hawaii 5th Climate National Assessment that was also emphasized in that paper. The solutions are rooted in history, local, and are constantly adapting, and can be importantly integrated with scientific knowledge. So they're not mutually exclusive in that sense. There's also multiple co-benefits. There's linguistic, cultural diversity that exemplifies as well as we look into biological diversity. However, one of the drawbacks is that relevant indicators require a lot of collaborative efforts. They're difficult to come up with, and right now they're very rare. Any questions so far? So that's kind of my introduction. No? So my research overview, my dissertation is broken up into 3 different parts. Well, before I talk about that, these 3 separate fields, I think, have a lot of opportunities for combining aspects of each in this interdisciplinary research, and this is the area that I'm super interested in, and I want to simultaneously address some of the gaps in all these 3 fields with my dissertation. So my dissertation is broken up in 3 parts. The first part is how do you operationalize natural capital accounting in Hawaii? What are some of these challenges? What are some of the processing steps that are involved? And also some of the policy applications, because that's important. The second part is how can natural capital accounting be more bottom-up? So there I'll be honing down to one Aotearoa, which is a small district, instead of the entire main Hawaiian Islands, and be looking at accounting for household or production and things that are, can be classified as environmental protection expenditures. I'm also looking to model contribution of submarine groundwater discharge on downstream water flow ecosystem services. So that's something that we know is a gap as well in the hydrology literature. And lastly, I want to look at how my cultural ecosystem services be understood in relation to current non-market valuation methods that are elicited by willingness to pay and willingness to accept. So just to give everybody a bit of background, because I know not everyone has spent the last couple of years looking at natural capital accounting. So I like this graph because it's primary colors, but Also, they're very clear in terms of the different kinds of capital that contribute to our society's well-being. We know the red areas are capital stocks and flows that are currently accounted for in our economy. So the red boxes, the red arrows, as well as the red circles. The green areas are what I'm trying to account for. These are natural capital flows and stocks. And you can see that the arrows are somewhat overlapping. So that's to signify that this risks of double counting. So we have to be very careful as national accountants to try and break these apart and make sure that we're not double counting in any case. Also importantly, in the yellow circle, there's a large part of non-monetary benefits that cannot be accounted for or valued under the current GDP, for example. So you see that overlap with GDP. So there's some things that can be accounted for and valued, but other things that cannot be valued that way. And so part one of my dissertation is really just to look at the stocks of natural capital here, as well as a bit of some of the services. The second part, I'm looking at the whole slew of natural capital, some of the flows of ecosystem services, as well as perhaps some of the feedback. And ecosystem service is, some of it can be accounted in monetary values, others can't. So that box is in that Venn diagram over there in the intersecting area. And the third part really is just looking at valuation and how might welfare values cover some of those orange parts or the yellow parts of the benefit. So just to situate everybody in terms of like where my dissertation is going and different parts of my dissertation where that addresses. So when you talk about value, I wanted to introduce total economic value. This is something that is used by economists to look at use values and non-use values. So use values are, for example, direct use, indirect use values, for example, fisheries or tourism, recreation. Indirect use values are biological support to seabirds, turtles, and the like. So this I'll address in part 1 and 2. I will be delving into use values, and it's also the area where NCA is primarily involved in. Part 3 is where I bring in some non-use values, because we're talking about economic welfare values that necessarily includes some non-use values. So that's where I will bring in some non-use values like existence. So knowing that something exists, giving you the benefit that something is alive and not extinct. That's an existence value, for example. Bequest is something that, say, you want to have this core forest be handed down to your progeny, your grandchildren. So that's kind of a bequest value. To operationalize NCA, we obviously require an accounting framework. So the accounting framework that we're using is a system of environmental economic accounting framework. See, it's a bit of a mouthful. So it's structured in 4 discrete accounts. I know there's 5 bubbles, but 2 of them are kind of the same thing. Just one of them is monetary and one of them is in biophysical metrics. So again, part 1, I'll be looking at ecosystem extent and condition accounts. Part 2, some services and some monetary services. And then part 3, just ecosystem services. Okay, any questions so far?
I like the cultural value is something that I thought was seems like a pretty important non-use value. That's going to be a big part of it, yeah.
So that's where my third part, I think, is really to go into that cultural value. Yeah.
I had one question about, you mentioned, I don't want to speak too long, but you mentioned double counting.
Yeah.
What type of double counting? When is that a problem?
So I think when ecosystems, for example, timber that's used, if it's sold in a market or if you catch the fish, that profit or the price you pay cannot be attributed entirely to the ecosystems. Some of it is actually manufactured, like for example, your boats or your saws, that is already accounted for in the macroeconomic national accounts.
Okay,
So I'll really have to
Yeah.
deduct those.
okay,
So it's really trying to get the
the
premium,
resource
yeah,
value,
the
rent.
resource rent,
Okay,
the residual value or the resource rent. So part one, just to refresh everybody, I know there was a lot thrown at you. I wanted to talk about some of the challenges and the processing that I've done with these ecosystem accounts, as well as 2 policy applications that I plan to explore. So one of the first steps to do is to, okay, what is our ecosystem accounting area when we're doing any sort of accounts? We discussed with stakeholders as well as looked at literature to, come up with MOKU as the best social ecological zone to do this accounting. And importantly, for those who don't know, it extends into the nearshore marine biome as well. So it's Marcus Mackay. Rich to reef management is key to maintenance of healthy reefs. We know a lot of native species use both the marine as well as the freshwater habitats at different life stages of their life. And there's also a lot of abiotic transfer. So across these habitats. So that's important. Importantly, it also has significant cultural and relational connections tied to those socio-ecological zones. So after we decided on the accounting area, okay, well, what are some of the ecosystem services of consequence? Again, we dive back into the literature to look at some of the highly valued ecosystem services, and those are recreation related, biomass provisioning, specifically fisheries, as well as flood mitigation for coastal protection of largely developed areas. And so based on these ecosystem services, the framework recommends that we go through this exercise called logic chains. So the logic chain is really to establish, okay, well, if you look at the right, what kind of ecosystem type are we kind of focusing on? And if we're looking at fisheries, then it's coral reefs, it's coral dominated hard bottom. And then looking at the factors of supply, be they ecological, be they societal, factors determining use. So this is more of a demand aspects of the ecosystem service. So I looked at, for example, restrictions, catch restrictions, management areas. And then you want to look at what are some of the potential metrics that can measure those ecosystem services. As you go down the list, then you want to attribute those flows of ecosystem services to particular, well, get the benefits first. What kind of benefits? Is it food? Is it mental health, well-being? Is it a sense of community? And then attribute it to main users and beneficiaries who are economic units in this national capital accounting framework. So those economic units can be households, they can be industries, they can be NGOs, they can be local communities, but importantly, that's you can crosswalk that with your national accounts, which spits out GDP figures. So yeah, some of the important determinants, like your coral dominated hard bottom extent, the health of your coral reefs. So what is the density of your adult corals? What is the degree eating week in that area? How are the primary consumers, the fish, doing? So those are some things that can be populated when the ecosystem condition comes. And this is just a mind map of like how we go about doing this logic chain. So the supply side constraints, supply side considerations, as well as the demand management. And then we go to the geoprocessing, which has caused me a lot of heartache over the years as well, because of very different spatial resolutions. There's different levels of uncertainty. And so I'll just take you very quickly through some of the steps. For example, the agricultural land use census is most authoritative because people actually go down to conduct census of these farmers, what are they growing. So you see these gaps on the top right. So I take land use, land cover, remote sensing data sets, I cut those out. You know, those are the most authoritative, they can't be wrong. And so you basically go down this chain of looking at, okay, what's the most authoritative, which has the best accuracy, and then you use those to overlay them. And you can see here there's vectors as well as rasters. So rasters are pixels, whereas vectors are lines. So rasters have different resolutions as well. And for beaches and dunes, those are very small. So you can't really use 30 meter or 10 meter resolution. So I had to use another data set, which you see at the bottom right, called CCAP, which only has 2 years of coverage in Hawaii, 2010 and 2011, which is the most recent one. So I've had to make certain assumptions when I'm geoprocessing, which leads me to the next point. This has to be documented in a very reliable way. And so everything is open source, the outputs, the processes, the data sources, metadata, all that ideally will be fully public in the future when I do publish this. And importantly, I'm also using open source geoprocessing libraries in R. So you don't have to pay, 5 figures for an ArcGIS license. You can use QGIS, you can use R to replicate some of these things. And so that helps with the policy application, I think. So based on the lit review, some of the consultations we have with the advisory technical committee, we've come up with a slew of data sets that we can use. So I'm using a subset of these for the main Hawaiian Islands accounting projects. So there'll be ecosystem extent stuff. A lot of it is federal data sets from NOAA, from USDA, from USGS, but also local data sets like the stream habitat conditions score. Also, we go into the ocean. Remember, MOCO stretches into the ocean. So we have a lot of NOAA as well as ocean tipping points data sets as well. That will tell us the chemical state, the compositional state, structural state, and these typologies are recommended by the SIA framework as well. So this current state of our data collection. So I want to transition to applications, because if we just have those accounts, it wouldn't be very useful. I mean, okay, there's a lot of this data, what can we do with it? The first application is it can integrate a lot of Hawaiian knowledge systems, the heritage. One way I'm thinking of doing it is looking at these socio-ecological zones, these VAU. And if you could see on the bottom left, for example, the green portions are the VAU Akua, which is like your cloud forest, your sacred forest. And if we know kind of generally the extent of that in Kauai, we can monitor maybe, okay, well, how much of it is native in 2015? So as I overlay that with the VAU Akua, I can say, okay, maybe this percentage of that in this moku is still native dominated. How much forest cover is it? How much of it is grasslands? How much of it has been developed? So these are coming up with condition variables that integrate some of these biocultural knowledge. And another application is, for example, the Bremer's done a recent paper with Uhiro, I think, on multi-strata agroforestry. And they've determined a limit of rainfall precipitation where that becomes unfeasible, but for economic reasons. So you need irrigation, you need all sorts of other extra investment. So you can use data, for example, to say by moku. So those all those names in the bottom in the x-axis. Those are all the different moku in the main Hawaiian Islands. Okay, well, based on 1990 rainfall, 2013 rainfall, 2016 rainfall, what is a good place, or maybe what are some of the places that we can't do multi-strata agroforestry anymore? So that's also a possible application that I plan to kind of look into. The second application, definitely more conventional, and this is why NCA is set up, is to complement GDP measures. At the federal level, there's been the first tranche of marine satellite economy. We'll see what the current administration will take this. But we have good data on, by marine economy, by marine activity, sorry, in Hawaii. And with that, we could say, okay, there's been 10 billion increase in GDP from 2014 to 2018 in tourism and recreation, coastal industry. How might those GDP benefits be decomposed at the moku level? And I've been looking at census to kind of try and decompose that, because the data is only at the state level. On the flip side, I also want to look at what are the environmental costs. Sure, there are all these GDP benefits, but they must come at environmental costs. So looking at the environmental externalities and what the spatial distribution of those costs are, with the extent and condition accounts, can come up with interesting correlative studies, I'd say at the least. But it'll definitely create an interesting panel where we can compare one-to-one or perhaps lagged dependencies. Yeah, so that's the end of my first part. Questions so far? Yeah.
I have one question. There's
Yeah.
kind of two parts to it, but I think referring to your slide 14, really looking at the moku level. And there is one moku on Maui, Honuaula, that actually encompasses Ho'olave as Ahupua itself. So there's an ocean in between. So how do you account for that? Like, is there, because that's difficult, right? And then with all your layers and things like that.
Yeah.
That's my first part.
Okay, the easy answer is we're using the state moku boundaries, which it takes a shoreline and then gives it 3 miles or 5 kilometers out into the ocean. So it doesn't go technically with the traditional Aupua or moku boundaries. For He'ia, which I'm doing in part 2, it will extend to the traditional boundaries. So that's something that we can improve on, I think. But going into, that sort of blue water region, it's difficult enough doing the nearshore coastal accounting. Going into those deeper areas where things move about even more, and water's moving as well. So temperature, all that is going to be very variable, can be a bit challenging. So I think I would cut it off at the reef or the coastal as it is. Yeah. But I will think about, and I haven't looked into that yet.
Yeah, just a curiosity, just because like animals don't know those boundaries, they move back and forth. So if you're trying to account for that, like the movement is a bit.
So we do probability, right? So what is the probability that you'll see an Ulua there, or like you'll see Piscivorus there? So that could be another way of doing it. So you can use statistical measures to come up with probabilities of likelihood of presence. Yeah, but that will require surveys, require money.
Yeah.
So it gets very complicated very quickly. Yeah.
So related to the same example is I saw that you had like a soil order layer or component to your accounting. So I know that when it comes to quality of soil data, same thing, Kaho'olawe it's poor. We don't know a lot about the soils over there versus maybe the other part of the same moku, which is a part of the larger Maui Island. So how do you account for like the quality of data and the disparity that comes with that?
The soil stuff we've just taken from the NRCS database. I haven't had the capacity to really dig down into the nuances of
No pun intended.
soil, yeah. But like, if you want to collaborate, you know, you guys have good data, yeah.
Is there any trend data in the US? Yes, it's just a cross section, yeah.
For the land cover and the land use, yes,
And the, and the soils, like
the
that's,
soil.
there's
yeah,
no trend data in that, yeah.
Yeah, no, unfortunately.
And you way back, I don't think Hawaii's part of it, but there was a trend database. What did they call that? Why am I blanking on it? I used to use this data a lot.
The data time series, time series?
Yeah.
Soil time series.
It's a survey of points. Stratified random sample over the whole US, but I think. well,
But it's
like a
not
lot
the
of it-
Surgo.
No, it's not Surgo, but it's supposed to track land use change. And it does have the soils and everything, but I don't think it has Hawaii and Alaska.
A lot of it is cones.
Yeah, so, I'm blanking on the name.
Yeah, we have
I
it.
think it's,
I'll look
I think
at
it's
it.
called NRI, but I forget what that stands for, and I used to work with that data a lot. Yeah, natural resources inventory, I think that's what it is, but I don't think it covers Hawaii, but it would be worth looking at just in case. If they did have it, it would be incredibly thin, they probably wouldn't have very many points, but at least it would give you a trend. And it would go back a ways.
Questions? So part two, so that was the main Hawaiian Islands. The part two is where I'm going into He'ia, on the windward side of Oahu to do a more finer scale granular accounting. So I really want to look at household or production, for example, and model some of the impacts of submarine groundwater discharge on downstream, specifically downstream for ecosystem services. Just to introduce He'ia for you, for those people who are unfamiliar, the National Estuarine Research Reserve is housed there. Its mission, you can see here, is to promote stewardship through native Hawaiian philosophies and values. And you can see they work with multiple partners in the local ia, the fish pond, Papahana up on the Mauka, Kapo Iwi, who plants and grows a lot of cultural foods, as well as HIMB. So that's the extent of He'ia Aupua. As you saw, Christy, that's the one that goes into the ocean, and it covers part of Kaneohe Bay as well. So those we're using that boundary for He'ia. So biocultural approaches to NCA in He'ia specifically is trying to keep the water molecule on land for as long as possible. So there's food being grown up on Mauka, there's water, sediment, nutrients that comes down to the flooded ag fields, the lo'i, and then the sediments are trapped there, there's more food grown, and then into the fish pond where the nutrients are trapped, there's more food. It's more food that's grown there, and eventually as the water comes out of the fish pond, it's clean and it doesn't harm the coral reefs. So each of these steps are maintained by biocultural practices at each stage. So what I'm going to try and do is account for some of these, I guess you could say, human inputs or manufactured inputs, or environmental protection expenditures. The second thing is, okay, well, there's also a lot of ecosystem services that are present in this whole system. So I was trying to crosswalk with folks at He'ia to see what are some of the important ones. And because I have limited and scarce resources, I am going to be focusing on particularly water flow maintenance, ecosystem services. So for the first part, household home production, they're really characteristic of in-kind subsistence economy. So there's a lot of volunteer workforce that's being used to maintain and conserve some of the land. Food is given away or food is also sold at below market rates. So these can be seen as like a subsidy to households. So I think this would be making a lot of the unseen things that are not accounted for in national accounts seen. And a lot of that work can also be classified under SEER framework as environmental protection expenditures. So this is one way where we can account for that feedback effect of impacts and management back to the natural capital. So ecosystem services tend to look at it in a linear fashion where natural capital produce services to humans and that's it. But it can be endogeneity in there where a lot of those human inputs then create even more ecosystem services. So I'm trying to at least put in accounts, not model it, but at least put in accounts the impacts and the management inputs that are going back into the natural capital. So that's one. The second part is water flow regulation ecosystem services, and that's a definition of it. But what that really means is in He'ia, there's a lot of dike impounded groundwater aquifers up on that elevation that when you create a tunnel or well through it, it drains, it takes a lot of water out of the system. So you can see on the windward side of Oahu, a lot of it is dike impounded groundwater. And there's been a lot of studies on the impacts based on the USGS stream gauge, which is at very high elevation. And we do have gauges now at He'ia downstream sources, but we're unable to disentangle the submarine groundwater discharge. Because it's a groundwater dependent ecosystem, there's a lot of discharge that goes straight from up there and it comes out where the water table meets land. So we're unable to disentangle some of those effects, and that's why I think these ecosystem accounts can be an interesting way to kind of model some of those impacts. So this is a map of the NER is in orange, and the Ahupua'a is in red, and the USGS stream gauge is all the way up here, up Malka and He'ia stream, or Haiku stream, and we have all these NER monitoring stations downstream, close to the wetlands as well as the fish ponds. So the empirical setup, my dependent variable will be a composite variable, but I will also be testing them individually. So that's your downstream flow, as it were. So your water depth in these streams, how much salinity is there? Because if it's brackish, if there's a lot more fresh water coming in, that salinity is going to drop. So with less salinity, we know that there's a lot more freshwater inputs coming in. Water temperature is a big one as well. Usually water from the aquifers is a lot lower temperature. So we can lump this in a composite variable, or we can study them individually as dependent variables. For the independent variables, I've come up with a fairly simple model here. I'm just isolating the effects upstream so that they're not affecting, they're not convoluting our model. So I've upstream groundwater abstraction, and we have very good data maintained by USGS as well as the Board of Water Supply. How much of that water is taken out from those tunnels and wells? I have very good rainfall data as well, spatially as well as temporally discrete. I have decent amount of land cover data that goes back to the late 2010s, human population, and then surface flow from the USGS gauge. So really, I'm trying to parameterize these upstream effects on downstream submarine groundwater discharge. And this is a very quick timeline. I know I'm running a little bit behind, but what I'm trying to do is to parameterize the modern data so that we can go back in time. And as we go a little bit back, the data starts to get a bit sketchy. But we know that Haiku Tunnel, Haiku Well, these were two major exogenous shocks to the hydrology of that watershed and that Ahupua'a. So a lot of water was taken out after these two main big constructions. So we have good stream gauge data. We have good extraction data after these tunnels and wells were constructed as well. For land cover and land use, we have some model agroecology. We have model population cover, pre-contact, and there's also archival stuff. So I'm planning to do maybe, if necessary, I'll be doing interviews, participatory mapping to get at some of the missing gaps of these historical data. Yeah, just to run through some of the slew of data sets that we have at AEA, all the water quality stuff. Yeah, depths, the stream discharge, we have very good data, even before 1944, actually. Yeah.
What happened in 64? I mean, there was a clearly a high discharge.
Yeah, not sure. Yeah, that's a huge one. It might be a flood.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
tautological.
But it's usually pre-drilling of the well, the cubic feet per CFS discharge is around 3 or 4. So after you can see after that it's dropped a lot. So historical ecology reference conditions are important in accounting, but nobody really knows what to do with it because no one can agree on what is a good reference. Is it a date? Is it, you know, some political change or some exogenous shock? We don't know. So I think this is also interesting. We can look at what is a good reference for water flow in this area by looking at all these data sets, but also maybe doing interviews with Kupuna there. And this is more supplementary data, more for the volunteer hours, as well as some of the production Carlo that's sold, all the farm produce that's sold in Kako farm. So some of the benefits is we can make some of the unseen human contributions seen. It will boost transparency, quality of accounting and audits. One of the things that might help is loan applications. We know conservation organizations are always looking to get loans, and they're always looking to establish their assets. Okay, how can we do a quality audit of this? So these accounts can help in that. We also can understand downstream submarine groundwater impacts, and that can help the Board of Water Supply, the Water Commission, in kind of navigating the legal public trust doctrine of water, and also allocating enough for Hawaiian customary use under law, as well as the in-stream flow standards that AEA is trying to come up with for their surface flows. Okay, so that's the end of my second part. Questions? Okay. So the third one is we're looking at specifically cultural ecosystem services. How can they be understood in relation to non-market valuation methods? So cultural ecosystem services technically cannot be fully accounted for under SEA, and they're very clear about that. You know, because they only admit use values. So there's a huge part we know of spiritual, artistic, symbolic, cultural ecosystem services that are non-use. So they fall outside the confines of SEA. But what if we look at cultural ecosystem services from a that emits non-use values? And economics actually has a way to calculate these welfare values, and we can analyze the demand for these cultural ecosystem services as such. So we can estimate the people's willingness to pay, willingness to accept, which these illustrations will capture both use as well as non-use values. So here I want to investigate what is the true price of these cultural ecosystem services. But to do that, I'll be leveraging a lot of demand theory from econs, but also looking at substitutability of some of these goods. One has cultural value and the other one maybe has no cultural value or very little cultural value. So the first thing I'm looking at is kalo or poi versus cassava or rice. And Aino restoration conservation lands versus development lands, and have people kind of trade off these two different things. So the survey will be given out at market, at the Kako EV market, point of sale, but also volunteer work days. I'll be using a single binary choice survey. It's supposedly the most incentive compatible survey method. And the only trade-off is that I'll require a very large sample size because it's a single question. And these have to be unique people. And so the survey will be targeted at people have some connection to He'ia and cultural foods. So just to give you a brief outline of the questions, we submitted this to IRB review, and they've been reviewing it since January 28th. The one for Carlo is, for example, these are randomized, by the way, the cost premiums. Are you willing to pay $2 more per pound for Carlo without changing the quality? If no, then you check another box. So that's the main question of interest. The willingness to accept, which is the analog, which is the mirror opposite, is okay. Are you okay with the Carlo being replaced with cassava and rice? So cassava and rice will be grown at the ear. Will you buy the same amount, but you get the discount? So that's a willingness to accept some benefits, but then you lose the cultural, supposedly benefits or the premium to it. And then for the Aino restoration conservation lands, I'm looking at, are you willing to pay a premium for this funds to be channeled for conservation? No, you check no, and the willingness to accept. Mirror will be if Carlo is made more affordable, so you get cheaper price for Carlo. Are you okay that there might be a higher risk that these conservation lands will be developed in the future, commercially developed in the future? Interestingly, I'm also trying to have a split payment vehicle experiment where people trying to use volunteer hours instead of money. So for the willingness to pay, are you willing to volunteer, say, 5 more hours a month at He'ia to keep the prices, for example, Carlo at the stable, or to sustain Aino restoration at He'ia? No, you should no. And the opposite for willingness to accept is, are you okay with allowing commercial developments on these lands in the future? But the flip side is you might see an annual increase in your median income in your area. So we thought about tax credits, and that wasn't something that the community really liked or could kind of understand. So this was the closest thing we have. And we'll keep developing refining these survey instruments as we move forward. So we're collecting a bunch of informational as well as demographic questions, perception of property rights, payment of it or incentive consequentiality, income bracket, zip code, age group, whether they're native Hawaiian or not, do they live in Hawaii, how much do they already volunteer, for example. So this is really just covariates where we can study different segments of the demographic. Okay, so I'm going to go through some econs. So bear with me. Willingness to accept can technically be larger than willingness to pay for any environmental good, any changes here. And according to theory, it can be larger if there's few or no substitutes to that good. There's very large ecosystem changes, so the marginal changes are very large. The income constraints the willingness to pay. There's differences in possession of property rights. Behavioral reasons, for example, risk aversion, uncertainty, bounded rationality, as well as moral values. And these really can all be applicable to cultural ecosystem services. And the empirical model I'm using is based on Hahnemann 2003's paper. And what I'm trying to really estimate is the shaded area, which is not technically the shaded area, but let's just say this is the willingness to pay and willingness to accept, and the welfare of this increase in ecosystem service. So the x-axis is really a quantity or quality of ecosystem services, and then your y-axis is the price of that ecosystem. So as we are in utility increases, it asks what, sorry. So he's come up with an inverse compensated demand, which is X as a willingness to pay function for increases in Q. So that inverse compensated demand basically compensates you for any income effect. So it tells you, okay, you currently buy all these consumer goods. If I gave you all the income necessary to buy that same basket of goods, but more and more, how much are you willing to pay for an extra unit of ecosystem services? Or what is the price flexibility of that income? Oops, I keep pressing up. And we can isolate substitution effects as well with that bundle of private goods. So we can come up with theoretically a bound, which is the compensating variation. This will be your willingness to pay, as well as your willingness to accept. So that real value will be probably unknown to all of us, to individuals, but we can have a mean and we can know that what's the lower bound and what's the upper bound of these welfare values. This is the empirical model. We assume, again, willingness to pay and willingness to accept follows a normal distribution. The normally distributed x is a vector of independent variables, and your beta as well as your gamma parameters that we're going to be estimating. So these survey respondents will provide an interval bounded responses together on aggregate. So if someone says, oh, I'm not willing to pay this amount, so it's probably less than that, but it cannot be negative. So it's left censored. If they're saying I'm willing to pay this amount, that means it's probably this or more. So it's right censored to infinite. So it gives you that interval bound, for which you can then apply a conditional log likelihood function, and then you get the probability of observing that willingness to pay within those intervals using a cumulative distribution function. And then we can get our mean willingness to pay, willingness to accept for cultural ecosystem services. We get the variance as well. Importantly, we can also investigate the partial effects. So this is like the partial effects of, say, one of the covariates. What does that beta look like? Beta K or gamma K. The implications of this is, we can answer some of the questions like, okay, does willingness to pay and willingness to accept vary depending on your payment vehicle? Say I'm paying money in terms of dollars and cents, or paying in terms of volunteer hours. Are those two things different at the final analysis? Can we see a difference in willingness to pay and willingness to accept? And might that tell us a little bit about the substitutability, or how important to CES, how important cultural ecosystem services is to people? Because if they're similar, that means it's perfectly substitutable. With all the extra income, I'll just buy more private goods. I really don't want to buy more cultural ecosystem services. Does that vary with income? Does the willingness to pay and willingness to accept vary with income? There we can also look at if the CES is a normal good, meaning as you get richer, you want more of that. Or is it an inferior good? As you get wealthier, you want to buy less of it. Say something for Walmart, that's an inferior good because you don't really, you're better than that now. So that's just really, but nothing against Walmart. They're making a lot of the share prices are doing really well. CES may differ across different demographics, so we can also study that. This model allows us to test theoretical lower and upper bound of cultural ecosystem services and their welfare values. Yeah, I think that's the end. We can take questions for the last section or general questions from the other sections.
Okay, I'm look online. Feel free to raise hands online, but we'll take questions in the room.
But I have a question with a potential follow-up in this last section. Can you explain again when you were going over your survey?
Yeah.
How volunteer hours plays into the valuation, and then you mentioned something about tax incentive.
Yeah,
Could you explain that again?
so for volunteer hours, I could get them to pay their time, but I couldn't give them time back. So with money, I can give them time back, but I can't give time back to somebody. So I'll have to come up with some monetary incentive to compensate them for this loss. Does that make?
Yeah,
a bit
okay,
of
then
sense?
my follow-up question then is,
Yeah.
is there a framework for valuing the volunteers' hours? And I only asked this because earlier this year I looked into potentially creating a tax incentive for volunteered hours, and I had to dig through IRS documentation that said that they don't allow the valuation of given time for an economic incentive. I was wondering if there was another framework that you might have been using, or a different kind of idea that you were thinking of in terms of generating this benefit for their volunteer hours.
So I would say the IRS hasn't read the SEER. SEER framework. But supersede that, I'd say you can actually do
They were
that.
gonna do, but they expired those.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're certainly not reading it now.
It's-
Yeah, they all got fired.
So under the central framework, you can account for that as environmental protection expenditures if your main purpose is for, I can't remember the definition. There's resource management, but there's also environmental protection activities. They can then classify these, okay, then we can give them the wage rate. Or if they're working on the weekends, we can give them leisure, half work. Economists generally look at the leisure and work rates. If you're traveling, there's also a travel cost to the time.
I might have to talk to you later, and I'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Great presentation so far. And the question is of this willingness to pay, especially for Carlo. Well, just maybe, I think it might be biased, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, because some people might want to, or maybe have economic challenges, and color is really culturally important and spiritually important. So I was thinking, is there a way to reframe it and maybe ask how important color is to your household? Because as much as they might want to pay more, they are still not able to. I don't know if that makes sense.
yeah, that's an important question, and that's why we will collect some of the covariates of median income. So I'll be asking them, for example, what's your median income bracket? So I'll have some gauge of whether you're struggling or not. Maybe I should ask how many dependents you have. So that could be an additional thing if maybe your income might be okay above the median income, but you have like 4 or 5 dependents, or you're taking care of your auntie and uncle, which happens a lot. So yeah, good question.
Okay, a
Yeah.
question online from Kimin. Kimin, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Same question about the willingness to pay. So
Okay.
it's not a question, it's a comment. I also think it's I get the concept, I really like the idea. But I think you have to specify more substitutability. Like you can substitute something from like for the some amount of other things, because it could vary a lot depending on the situation that like the surveyees. So like his or her their positionalities really matter. In my case, depending on the situation, the willingness to pay like vary like 5 times or 6 times, depending on like if they have the services or not. So yeah.
It's a
I
little
like
hard to
the idea.
it's a little hard to understand you, so maybe we'll have you follow up with Louis
Yeah.
in person.
Yeah, feel
Unless
free.
you.
Yeah.
I really like the idea. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna have a whole closed door session.
Okay, I just wanted to say just briefly that willingness, this is the context where I think willingness to accept is powerful relative to willingness to pay. Because if people can't afford it, because they have low income, but it's something they still really value. That means they're gonna have a really high willingness to accept. But a lower willingness to pay that's bounded by income. And so I think in this context, that's important.
Mhm.
You know,
Okay, so we're gonna take a short break, Louis, and guys can congratulate him for getting through this phase at least. And we'll figure it out. So Louis, let's try to keep it to 5 minutes because I know a lot of committee members have to go.
actually, I have more time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, 6 minutes.
6 minutes, yeah. Time to go get a drink, say hi to everybody, bye to
Thanks
everybody.
for people, for
Yeah,
joining
oh yeah,
online
I'm
as well.
gonna stop the